Hey, I'm Alan Furstenberg.
And I'm Mark Tucker, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Welcome back, everyone. And how's it going, Mark?
It's going well. It's good to see you again. It's good to talk about AI and other topics with you today.
Indeed. And this is going to be an interesting crossover one, I think. Back crossing over with the topics we always used to talk about. Um, AI agents have been really, really big topic of discussion recently, and Google
Yep.
recently published a white paper about at least what they're calling agents.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be good to use that kind of as a launching point for us to discuss, uh, you know, what do we see AI agents as? How do they fit in? How do we use them? What are they really? Um,
Well,
what
what I
aren't
liked
they?
about what I liked about the article was is that it's pretty hefty, right around 40 pages, but they try to go about defining what is an agent, how is that different um, than just using something like ChatGPT. Talks about different components. It gives some code examples. So it's trying to take you from not really knowing anything about agents all the way to here's how you can code using Google tools to you can create an agent. So
And
I
not
thought that
just
was
Google
good.
tools. I mean, they were showing tools from other libraries that were in Google as well.
Yep,
So that
that's
was
true.
nice. Um, I like how they kind of kicked it off right at the beginning. By talking about how it's agents are a combination of what they call reasoning, logic, and an access to external information, and then tying that together with the generative AI model. Um,
Yes.
and that's kind of what their fundamental definition of it is. And I thought that was a pretty good definition.
Yeah, it talks about being able to go off and do tasks, and that could be turning on devices. It could be making API calls. And that really kind of gets to the point of like what we uh, started the world as when we were doing voice stuff with Alexa and Google Assistant. Is that we've got this device, we're programming this assistant, which could be another name for an
For an
agent,
agent, yeah.
and you're teaching it or programming it to do a specific thing, and the user is able to kind of have a multi-turn conversation with it potentially. So
And I think that was one of the things that I really appreciated about the white paper was that um, this concept that they introduce called tools, and we're going to get to some of the concepts in a
yeah,
minute, was that they emphasized the fact that this wasn't just getting additional information; it was taking an action.
yeah,
And in fact, they emphasized in a couple of places that these tools could do things, not just get information. And I thought that
right,
was really a crucial point, that their notion of what an agent was kind of rested on this concept of, well, in part rested on this concept of doing things, of using an AI model to take it a step beyond what the AI model could do on its own.
right. So you've got like at a core, you've got an AI model, an LLM, a generative AI model. Lots of different ways you could talk about it, but at the core, it's been trained as of a certain date. So it's got information that, depending on how it's trained, that could fit what you care about. Or if you care about things that are newer than the model was created, then you have to use something like retrieval augmented generation, so where you're extending that. But that still could just be asking questions and getting answers. And what they're talking about as agents is that taking it a step further and taking some action. So
Well,
it's
I think their definition of agent is a broad one. So it does
yeah,
include, and I thought this
yep,
was interesting as well, it does include retrieval augmented generation as one of the tools that it
yeah,
had. Um,
that's true. That was
I,
in the data store section.
right. I think we're jumping all over this article at this
I know,
point.
yeah, no, but we're giving people a little taste before we dive in.
um, but but I think that broad definition is actually a pretty good one. in some ways. And in other ways, I think it's kind of cheapening what the notion of an agent is. But we'll get to all of this, I'm sure. Let me start with another quote that they had about it, talking about how a generative AI agent, and they use that term specifically, is an application that achieves a goal. And it broadly says, again, nice broad definition, achieves a goal by observing the world and acting upon it using the tools that it has at its disposal. And I really like that because it has this notion of observing the world. It's getting information from its context.
Mm-hmm.
It is using a generative AI system as its decision-making body and using the tools to achieve that goal. And that kind of breaks it down into the three parts that it identifies as important in the architecture. So it says there's an agent has a model,
right?
And that's kind of the most obvious part of all of this.
Yeah.
But they define the model, and they defined it interestingly, I thought, as the centralized decision maker for an agent's process, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I agree with exactly that definition, but okay, I'll let it slide for the moment. So it has the model, it has tools, and these are things that interact with external data and services. And I thought that was a really nice definition.
Yep.
And again, we'll break that down some more in a bit. And what they call orchestration. And the orchestration part included things like user profiles and the goals and instructions and memory to manage a conversational state and the observed world around it. And this is where they then put model-based reasoning and planning. And I'm kind of looking at that going, so wait a minute, is that the logic part? And if that's the logic part, what's the model supposed to be? And in a number of their examples, they're showing all of that reasoning, all of the logic part, as being in the orchestration level, which I thought was interesting. Did you notice the same thing?
I did. And what it seems to be saying to me is that the model on its own can do lots of things. It can answer a question, it can write a poem, and it's the orchestration that is kind of focusing that model in on understanding what the user is asking, looking at its tool belt to see what tools are there to use, figuring out which tool to use first and in what order, to ultimately keep going through this process to figure out that it's at a point that, hey, I've got the answer that I was looking for, or like I've called the one or more tools I needed to call, and I finally get into the goal's been accomplished, and so now I'm going to report the goal back. So I don't know that necessarily the logic. There's probably some sort of logic, and there's different strategies they've talked about in here that we can kind of talk about, but it's a thing that's interacting, working with the model to accomplish the goal.
And I'd agree with that. I feel like part of my problem is that I feel like it, in a lot of ways, the paper kind of blurs the line and in some ways doesn't really know what is supposed to be in the model and what's supposed to be in the orchestration layer. So I would have said the model is responsible for translating things, for helping make some sort of determination or categorization or things or translation or transformation. Whereas the orchestration both determines what goes into that and analyzes the output from that. So the model itself doesn't become the decision maker. It's the orchestration that's really the decision maker, but it's using the model to help understand each round of the task.
Yeah, it's and this is probably oversimplifying it, and kind of the mental model, but it's almost like I've got this problem, and you send a first query to the LLM saying, these are my tools available, and this is what I want to accomplish. What do you think I should do first? And then it's coming back with something, and it's like, okay, I'm going to try that thing. So then it actually calls the tool and executes the code, and it gets the response back, and it says, am I done yet? What would be the next step I would need to do to accomplish this? And so it's logic that you would normally have to code is the thing that's trying to be handled by this orchestration layer. Now there is some configuration and some other things, and it would be interesting to take a peek behind the scenes at what the different strategies for the different orchestration is doing. But they did a good job of following through like a log, which in essence shows kind of the orchestration thinking, in quotes, about what it should do next, and kind of like outputting almost like a stream of consciousness of what it's doing to get to the goal that it's
Right.
trying to get to.
And one of the nice things about that is that certainly, from my perspective, having coded it and worked with them, I could see where that orchestration layer was, sending out something to the model and getting back a response and evaluating that response.
Yeah.
I feel like the paper kind of brushed over that notion.
Yeah.
And there were various places where I feel like they're just kind of either glossing over what the model's real role is, or just kind of mixing everything up.
Yeah.
I expected a little bit more clarity. So, to use that example where they were talking about what's known as a React scheme or pattern or methodology, you might pass off to a model, a query or a question comes in from the user, and you might pass off that question from the user and say, here is a query from the user, how would we approach solving this problem? You're not asking it to solve the problem. You're asking it how it might approach solving the problem. And it might give something back. And then you take that response and hand it off to a different model, maybe one that's better tuned for that sort of thing, and say, follow these processes. Here's the prompt, now execute it.
Yep.
That's a traditional React pattern. And some of what we're seeing, though, is that models are now building this in themselves. So you're getting models that exhibit some of these characteristics by default.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that the models are blurring the line between agents and models.
Yeah. In essence, I guess conceptually, you could reproduce what these orchestration layers are doing by doing multiple prompts
Yes.
into some LLM and getting the response back, and then using that and making sure the right parts are in conversational memory and in the context, and then you're asking the next part. So what's, I guess, something to think about is, typically if you come from a world of Google Assistant or like Dialogflow or Alexa, then a request comes in, the intent is figured out, any slots are identified, code gets run, output is generated, some sort of state happens, and in essence, that's one conversation turn.
Right.
Right. The engine, whatever that was, in that case, a traditional NLU, intent classifier, slot filler, whatever, happens once per turn. And when you're writing prompts and working with something like ChatGPT, you have multiple turns. So what that's really is what's saying is when you interact with an orchestration layer, there could be multiple, requests or queries,
Yes.
prompts, whatever you want to say, to the LLM, a response back, some processing, doing the next one. So it could be 2 to 10 to 20 seconds, a minute, I don't know, whatever,
Well,
right? It's undetermined the number of steps that it figures out and the number of times that tools are called and in what order. So that's a little bit more challenging because, in some ways it's easier because you're like, I don't have to do this thing as a developer. But then it's also more challenging is like, I'm trying to understand what this thing is doing, or why is it taking so long, and how do I have to, if this is interacting directly with a user, then what patterns do I have to put in place so that the user knows what's going on or expects an asynchronous workflow or whatever.
And that's an excellent point. That you now have 3 points in there that I wanted to reply to, and I'm going to need to remember them all. I think the first in that this is an important point, and this is one that I'm glad the paper brought up, is that orchestration is, as they put it, it's a cyclical process. So it takes in the information, it performs some internal reasoning,
Yep.
and uses that reasoning to inform its next action or decision. So it's iterative. It will do this until at some point it feels like it can break out of that cycle, that it has the answer. But ideally, it's going through this in multiple steps that it is determining, or it is using the model to help determine. And I think that some of where it gets a little fuzzy is that in some cases, those steps are predetermined, so that the orchestration layer knows certain things need to be executed in a certain way. Whereas in other cases, it's letting the model determine what the next step needs to be.
Yep.
And they hint at that, but they're a little fuzzy on that notion in some cases. Yeah. And the RAG examples are the one where that comes most to mind, where they're really fuzzy about exactly the role of the model. And the steps that the orchestration component takes are somewhat fixed. I already forgot everything else that it was that I wanted to reply to, but you had so cyclical was one of them. It'll come up, I'm sure. I'm not worried. So I think one of the other things I found really interesting about this is they went and tried to define what they mean by tools.
Yeah.
And break it down into some subcategories. And so they define tools as I said, interacting with external data and services. And as they put it, they unlock a wider range of actions. And I was really excited that they used the term actions.
Yeah.
One of the things that was weird, though, is that they define 3 types of tools. And they define them as extensions, functions, and data stores.
Right.
I appreciated, for starters, that they said data stores were a type of tool.
Yeah.
Because it was a great example. It's a great way to kind of say, here's how retrieval augmented generation fits into this scheme. But I was having trouble with their distinction between extensions and functions.
Yeah, it was one of the distinctions they tried to make was that functions actually execute on the client and extensions execute on the server in the context of this model orchestration.
Right. And that's where I started getting really confused.
Yeah, I got a little bit confused there too. In some cases, it seemed like maybe the different distinction was also that extensions, in essence, could wrap an API and call that API directly, but you might have issues like if it needs some sort of security token or authorization, right. And I'm like, okay, well, typically if a server is calling another server, and it needs authentication, there's some sort of a token, there's some sort of a OAuth, there's some sort of something that happens, and then it seemed like a function wasn't necessarily wrapping directly. It was wrapping a description of the thing that would need to be called, and it's kind of like placeholder, call this API here, and then the model would return that back to the code, and then the code itself was responsible for calling the function directly based on the metadata or the information that came with it.
Right.
Is that kind of how you saw it too? Kind
of. What I think, well, that description that you just gave of a function is quite accurate. I mean, that's how all of the models are implementing functions when they implement them these days. is, it's returning something for the caller to execute and then return the result. What kind of confused me is that they were talking about extensions as if they were part of the model, which, okay, I kind of get that. That makes some sense.
Yeah.
And the example they gave was Gemini has a concept of a code execution tool where you ask for something and it may write code and then run the code to give an answer. So I kind of get that. But then they kind of went and said the extension runs in the agent, whereas the function runs outside of the agent.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways I get what they're saying there, but I think if you substitute the word model for agent in that case, it's more accurate.
Because I had wondered about that too. Because if you do a function, then you're basically saying the model orchestration is saying, "Hey, I need to call this function now before I can go on. It's
Right.
time to call this function."
Or
And
alternately, and this is kind of the way we've discussed it in the past. It is the model saying, "Aha!" It is basically the equivalent of an intent.
yeah,
It's the model doing intent detection. This is the intent that the user called, and here are the slots to fill in. That's, for those of us that are familiar with the old intent slot, paradigm,
right.
functions are very similar to that.
Yeah, but it still seems like if it's being called or which thing is being called in the end is really left up to code that's outside of the agent's control.
Well, is it outside of the agent's control or is it outside of the model's control?
See,
This is
because does the agent contain all logic of what's happening to accomplish the goal? Or, yeah, so,
I mean, that's the orchestration layer, right?
yep.
I mean, the other thing that confuses me about this is that when they talk about the orchestration layer, they're talking about things like the profile, which I assume means the user profile.
Yeah.
So you've got an agent that is going to be acting on behalf of a user. So it's got the authentication information, all of that stuff.
Language, time zone,
Right. But
whatever else that's important, right?
I want to focus on the authentication information in this case,
Yeah.
in particular, though, because one of the things that they say about a function, why you want to use a function and not an extension, is because it has that kind of information that an extension doesn't. So that a function has access to authorization and an extension doesn't. And I don't get that distinction. I don't understand why they
If
make
in your
that.
context was a unique user ID and you had an extension that required one of the inputs to be that unique user ID, then you could make a call that was in the context of the specific user. So
if you were if you were saying an extension is part of an agent, if you're saying it's part of a model, then you're saying we need the model to have authentication information, which I think in general most of us would agree the model should not have.
right. So it's interesting, and I haven't really jumped into like the Studio tool from Google, but they say, well, here's examples, and here's how you would put this together. So I don't know, maybe exploring that directory a little bit more and trying to understand what they've classified as extensions and what they classify as functions or other things. Then that might help us get a better understanding of what they're trying to mean.
It might, and I sort of get it. Other things that they have currently as part of Gemini's built-in, everything they classify as a tool. So some of Gemini's built-in tools include Google search grounding,
Yep.
which we've talked about. It includes this code execution agent. I think the Vertex one even includes grounding against your own documents. So this is where data stores come in, for example. These are all tools, but there's no way to say only give access to the documents that this user has. You need to implement that as a function,
Yeah.
or a function in conjunction with the data store that has permission information. But that's something, again, I feel like that's something the agent should have and should know. And this is where I feel like this white paper as a whole kind of fell apart. Was they don't address authentication. They don't address authorization. They don't address identity. They don't, they don't say this, the agent is working on behalf of you, therefore it needs to have your credentials, your preferences, your information. This is the stuff that we discussed, that Lee and I discussed on last week's episode. If an agent is representing you, it needs to have your information. And that kind of wasn't covered in this white paper at all.
Yeah. The other thing that was challenging in the article was that it was trying to make an analogy to cooks, because we talk about what I consider strategies or different approaches for orchestration. So the document explains what I would consider 3 strategies or 3 kind of approaches to how this orchestration logic happens. One is React, the other one is chain of thought, and the last one is tree of thoughts. And it gave a little bit of an example with React and gave some brief discussions of it. And it tried to make a clarification by using some sort of an analogy of a chef and recipes. And if the chef is trying to, ad hoc it, make the recipe with just like flying by the seat of their pants, as opposed to maybe specifically being, supplied or like trained specifically on a certain type of like cuisine, like French cuisine. So it can handle that really well. Or one where it's like got all kinds of books and recipes and it's just like looking up something. But it was the comparison to that and an agent was just really hard, because you're like, the agent's not going to cut the vegetables for you or other things that it's like, okay, I'm not sure really where this is.
It makes a function call to cut vegetables.
Yeah. And I was just like, okay, so we've got robotic hands now, something, cutting vegetables.
that's. I don't want to go too far into this, but that's not that far out of,
I guess,
where people are going with some of this.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess I'm more still like, you're conversing with an agent who's doing things in the real world, and I guess a vegetable cutter could be an IoT device that's connected to your, your smart home or smart kitchen or something. So I guess, but it wasn't a totally effective analogy to help. It was not a great analogy these for me. Yeah.
I feel like what they were trying to say was, a chef in doing something will do things like do some reasoning based on information that they have, so they've got what the special of the night is, and how many of the ingredients they have, and how popular this item is, and then based on all of that, they may do, a variety of actions. And those could be, from preparing the food to ordering more food to notifying the waiters that, we're out of a certain item, or,
Yeah.
And that's kind of the analogy I felt like they were trying to make. It's not a great analogy, I'll agree. It's But when talking about the reasoning techniques, and I put that in quote again. It's kind of interesting. I feel like I was most familiar with the React one even before I realized that was the name of it.
Yeah.
It's using the LLM to kind of classify what should be done and then doing it, and then using it to evaluate the next step. What I found interesting is that they didn't define why it was called React. It's called React because it is reasoning and then taking action.
Action, yeah.
React. They didn't make that quite clear, though.
Well, and then searching it up and then like trying to get clarification, I kept getting the React client side framework. And so React was kind of challenging to look up.
Right. Oh, yeah. Because there's already a client library for JavaScript
Called React.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And then, whereas chain of thought is more trying to break things down into individual steps and then have it evaluate each of those steps piece by piece. Because large language models are better at doing small things, not doing big things. So, if you have a model that breaks it up into small things and then evaluates each small step, it tends to do a better job. And then a similar one called Tree of Thought, where you're kind of taking the same thing, but instead of having one concrete step, you're kind of saying, what are the different steps that we could do at this stage? Let's try all of them, see which one gave the best result, and then move on to the next stage for one of those branches, or for all of those branches. All of them have their pluses and minuses. I think what's interesting to me is they then kind of focus on React almost exclusively.
Yep.
And what you tend to see is that, and what I've tended to see a lot is that many of the agents, especially as part of that iterative process, are using React. Because it's, using the LLM to say, what should we do? It's doing it. And then it's evaluating it and saying, okay, did we do it? What do we do next?
Yep.
That's very much the React nature of things. So much so that the example that they give in the end, or towards the end, when using LangChain, a lot of it got hidden by the fact that LangGraph implements React. I mean, it's literally a one function call. And it does all of this stuff under the hood for you.
Yeah, it's like, here's the model, here's the tools, go do it.
Right. And that's nice, but it does kind of hide what's going on.
Yeah.
One of the other things I found kind of interesting about it is they drop little hints of ideas that they don't explore. And that was kind of frustrating. So, at one point, when they're talking about, again, the differences between extensions and functions, is they kind of suggest that functions are good if you are not doing this process in real time, or if, there needs to be additional information where you need to query the user for more information.
Yeah.
And I'm like, explore that.
Yeah.
Because they kind of, they introduce two different notions there that are important. One being this autonomous agent, where it just goes out and does stuff, and eventually checks back in with the home base, and either reports on what it has or asks for more guidance.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful notion that people are beginning to talk about.
Yeah.
Certainly back, when we were doing this in voice, the Open Voice Network was talking about this and how to do this sort of thing. Back in the early days of the web, we were talking about how to build these things. They were just, wander around the web and collect information and take action for you somehow, mysteriously. So they hint at that, but they don't explore it.
Yeah.
And that was frustrating to me. And then this notion of how functions could come back and get additional transformation logic, check in with the human, or, outside, some actions that take place outside of the agent. And I'm like, well, that's significant. I mean, that's saying that, before you do some things, you want a human in the loop.
Yeah.
But they don't explore that. And I felt like that was much more crucial to understanding the different kinds of agents that could that needed to exist, and they kept focused in on this notion of an agent just being a bigger model. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess generally reading through the whole thing, I'm like, okay, this was informational. It was a lot of stuff in one place where before I might have to go look around at different places. And as things evolved, it's kind of like I kind of grew to generally understand what an agent was, but it's kind of nice to have it all in one point. But then it kind of got done, and I'm like, well, in some ways we've made progress, but in some ways we haven't really made that much progress on
Right.
this.
I mean, I saw it as them trying to nail down
Yeah.
what a term was. Trying to nail down what is an agent, what is a tool.
Yeah.
Try, instead of having 100 definitions out floating around, nail it down. Unfortunately, feel like they nailed down the wrong thing, and they didn't really do a good job at doing so, because they left it. They really blurred the line between a model and an agent, and I think they did themselves a disservice trying to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, it is challenging, and trying to better define what the boundary is between the orchestration and the model itself as well. So,
And I think some of that, though, is the paper, this white paper was published in September of 2024, which is I don't feel like it got much traction until December or so, right around the same time that they released Gemini 2, which had, in their words, more agentic behavior. I feel like they defined an agent in terms of Gemini 2.0. Even though their examples didn't use Gemini 2.0. All of their examples use Gemini 1.5. But it's like they were trying to set up the definition framework for Gemini 2. And I wonder just how much this paper is saying what Gemini 2 looks like under the hood. Is Gemini 2 an agent under the definition that they give in this paper?
oh, yeah, that's interesting.
And I don't know. But I don't know. There are hints there are hints that it might.
Yeah.
So I thought it was, I don't know. I thought it was an okay paper. I'm glad that they said some things that they did.
Yeah.
In particular, talking about how tools could do actions. That was crucial, I think. But overall, I kind of wish they had taken it a couple of steps further.
Yeah. I agree too. It would be nice to see, kind of how documentation like this progresses over, the next year, and just see how much agents actually progress or change as well. And it would be good if we can come as a community, more of a shared understanding of what is meant. When I say a tool, I mean these things. When I say a function, I mean this thing.
Right.
When things like that.
I think also it was good for me to see that Google's perspective is more in terms of agents rather than in terms of generalized intelligence or super intelligence or this really mythical, bogus thing. And actually, one of the things I thought was interesting is that when they were talking about the model, they specifically said the model, a large or small model, or one that's custom built for your needs. They weren't saying it's an LLM.
Yeah.
They were saying the model could be of all types, which was really, really insightful, I thought.
Yeah.
So I think this was a good start, but I feel like it's just the next step in this long conversation we're going to have.
Right.
And I really would like to hear what other people's perspectives on this paper, but also about agents in general, are. I feel like we're going to have this conversation a lot more. I look forward to seeing more people joining in on this conversation as well.
Yeah, me as well. It's interesting because we've talked about agents before. We've talked about action models. So this paper is an opportunity to talk about those same types of things, but with perspective of other people. And I look forward to seeing where this goes, and also the work that other people do to progress this along. So hopefully we'll keep sharing as we learn, and you can share with us the things that you learn, and we can keep moving forward. So thanks for listening or watching, and we hope to hear from you in the comments as needed. And you can catch this topic or similar topics in future versions of Two Voice Dev.
Two Voice Devs.
Take care, Alan.
You too, Mark. Have a great week.